All right.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome, Jon. So, all that you've accomplished, so many things over the years, but the most latest accolade, I think, is that you were the very first band to perform on the 2025 Big Easy Cruise. You ushered it in last night.
I know. What an honor. Yeah.
How did it feel for you?
It was great. Yeah, it felt really great. I mean, I'm very lucky to have an amazing aggravation of musicians, as Mac Rebennack used to say. And it's just a joy to walk on the stage with this collection. They're all masters in their own right. And it's like being behind the wheel of a Rolls Royce on automatic pilot, because I don't have to do anything. I just, or surfing on the top of a very big wave. They're just great. Great players, a lot of good vibes coming off the stage, very talented, and they've all put many, many hours into years and years and years of hard work, learning their craft. And they're all on the same page, and they operate like a well-tuned engine. Everybody does their part. And it's lovely to have a band that can play a facet of New Orleans music that is really important, that is kind of being a little neglected, I think, which is the piano end of the funk thing, and especially the Caribbean aspects of New Orleans music. So, and the one rule is everybody in my band has to be able to sing, and they're all great singers.
Do you feel a little deficient sometimes as a singer compared to those guys? Or
sitting next to Nigel Hall? Are you kidding me? I'm scared to open my mouth. And Cornell Williams. Damn, I mean, they're all great. AJ's a great singer. Xavier's a great singer. So I'm very lucky, really.
As the song says, you basically just let the gentlemen do their thing. And,
Thank you.
And they do it. They do it. So I guess the first song played on the Big Easy Cruise was Lottie Mo.
Yeah.
Which was an old rhythm and blues song from New Orleans that, who did it?
Originally, it's Lee Dorsey. Great singer called Lee Dorsey. And it's a song that he had a hit with before he was associated with Alan Toussaint. He was already making records before the Alan Association. But the version we play is from an obscure recording that was made in the late 60s, where he re-recorded it with Alan Toussaint in the production and arranging chair with the meters, and so it's got that Caribbean groove. I like that.
Right,
that little funk thing.
The Spanish tinge. There's a little bit of that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you did that, and then the second song was Sea Cruise, which I think is pretty much the theme.
I thought that was the perfect tune. We're going to start the show. We should start with Sea Cruise, and that's actually a song we worked up for a Jazz Fest show last year, where I was able to feature perhaps one of the last working musicians of that generation in New Orleans who still plays great. And his name is James Rivers. He's 88 years old. And he was the saxophone player on the original Huey Piano Smith's version of Sea Cruise. Wow. And he tells great stories, because he played on all the Professor Longhair Mardi Gras records. That's him on Big Chief. He's on nearly all the Mardi Gras records. He's on Carnival Time by Al Johnson. He's on Big Chief. He's on Go to the Mardi Gras. Right. He's on Second Line. Bum, bum, bum. That's it. That's James Rivers. So he was in Huey Smith and the Clowns. He told me at the time when the band was, Huey Smith wasn't on the piano. He was on the recording sessions, but on the gigs he didn't go. He sent James Booker out, because James Booker could.
James Booker, the great New Orleans.
So it was James Booker, and it was Jesse Hill on drums.
Jesse Hill on drums.
Jesse Hill playing drums.
Ooh, poo, poo, doo, Jesse Hill.
Yeah.
Yep.
He used to play drums behind Fest too.
Did he really?
Yeah.
All right.
And Robert Parker was the other tenor player. So
Barefootin'. Yeah, that's a heck of a band right there.
Yeah, Barefootin'. So he's one of the old original guys, and still plays great. So for Jazz Fest last year, we did a show of traditional New Orleans rhythm and blues, because now in New Orleans at Jazz Fest you can see great brass bands, a lot of Indian tribes, a lot of funk bands. a lot of jam bands, a lot of Dixieland bands. But the thing that New Orleans is arguably most famous for is its rhythm and blues. And there's hardly anybody playing traditional New Orleans rhythm and blues. And so I think it's important to play it, but at the same time, it shouldn't be treated as a museum piece. You know, I think it's a valid art form, and there's room for it to continue to grow and develop. So you do that by writing new songs, and like any tradition, you have to spend a lot of time learning from the old guys and know where it came from, in order that it can very naturally move to the next, and grow into the next decade, you know, and keep going. That's the hope, anyway.
Well, and based on what you've said already in this interview, I'm reminded, not to name drop here, but when I interviewed Robert Plant one time, he knew more about New Orleans rhythm and blues and New Orleans rhythm and blues trivia than I do. And I grew up there. As I was telling John before we came out here, my dad had and has a vast collection of 45s from the 50s. So I heard all that music growing up. And yet, you guys in England, I mean, Robert and the Rolling Stones, Beatles, certainly you, delve so deeply into that music and know more about it than a lot of us natives, I think. So
I think that's an aspect of human nature, isn't it? Really? There's that cliche about the grass always being greener.
Exactly.
You know, things that are unfamiliar to you have an exotic quality. And I think for my parents' generation in England, life was being sort of lived in black and white. It was right after the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And England had been this incredibly powerful country. It had an empire. And all of a sudden it's reduced into penury. There's rationing. The cities are bombed out ruins. My mum and dad used to play in the ruins of bombed out houses. It was grim right the way through the 50s. And then you have Hollywood films and American jazz, and it just sounded like, I think it sounded like sunshine. So for a lot of people, it was something that seemed unattainable almost, but incredibly glamorous and positive in a world where everything was pretty depressing, you know.
Well, and not just American music in general, but music from New Orleans especially. I mean, to have that that joy and that funk and that sense of fun, that really must have sounded like something.
Before the whole R&B thing, it was New Orleans jazz. So my dad was in a skiffle band. Mm-hmm. My mum, as a teenager, would go out and hear New Orleans traditional jazz, English guys playing New Orleans traditional jazz. People that had been able to get these very cherished and rare, precious 78s that American GIs would have brought over in the war years. They were jealously guarded and shared and collected, and it was something they really, really loved. And of course, the New Orleans was at the heart of all that stuff. So all the famous English bands of the 70s all started out in playing skiffle, which was influenced by New Orleans musicians like Lonnie Johnson and Leadbelly, and all those guys.
And it made an impression, and they distilled something new out of that stuff. They took that and did something else with it.
Yeah, it was a great entree into music because you only needed to play 3 chords. It was a little bit like punk rock in the 70s, where you only needed 3 chords, some guitars, and a tea chest with a broomstick and a bit of string, and you had a skiffle band. And they sprung up all over England. And before skiffle, people didn't really see guitars. Guitars weren't things that you'd see everywhere. It was kind of like an exotic thing, a Spanish guitar. But next minute, there were guitars everywhere, and kids learning how to play Rock Island Line and Bring a Little Water Sylvie. And so when I was a little kid, my mum and dad would have parties, and all their friends would come over, and they would play skiffle tunes. So I grew up hearing Leadbelly tunes. They were the first tunes I learned to play or sing along to as a kid in family parties at home.
Well, and wasn't the story your uncle was a sailor, and he came to New Orleans at some point and brought some records back? Is that?
Well, I had one uncle that was in the Merchant Navy who would bring records back from America from my mum, jazz records. Mm-hmm. And in the 50s, he would bring back Little Richard records before they were released in England for my uncle, his younger brother. And that younger brother was taught to play guitar by my dad when he was courting my mum. And then he would go off and travel. He was a very exotic character in our lives. He would disappear sometimes for years at a time. We didn't know where he was, and he'd just go off on his travels, and then he would just suddenly appear again. And he went, yeah, you never knew where he was. One time I asked Mum where he was. Where's Uncle John? She said, oh, I think he's living in a cave in the Sahara Desert, darling. And he was in Mauritania living in a cave in the desert. Yeah. And then he was working shrimp boats in the Mediterranean. And then one day we got a postcard from New Orleans with a cotton ball attached to it and the preservation hall. And he said, I've only been here 2 days, but if I hear when the Saints go marching in one more time, I'm going to... but he would send these letters, and he would say, there's a great old piano player that plays here, and his name's Professor Longhair. And I'll bring you back some records. And then when he did come back, after a couple of years, he did suddenly turn up, and he had 2 suitcases full of 45s. So when I go and stay with him, I got this great grounding. He got a job in a golf course, which had an old Gothic gatehouse, and he lived in one side of this gatehouse, had gargoyles and everything. And it was the drive to a sort of a Downton Abbey kind of building. Great big stately home, and I would go and stay with him. And he was a painter, and he had beautiful paintings, portraits and stuff that he'd painted, and piles of records this big on every available surface, hundreds of them, and a funky little record player. And somehow the original casing had fallen apart, and he'd reassemble it inside a cardboard box. And he would open a bottle of wine, roll a spliff, and he'd say, "Oh, you got to hear this. You got to hear this." And he'd start looking for this record, and the search for this one particular riff that he wanted to play me would sometimes take 4 hours. But in the meantime, he would stumble across. Oh, in the meantime, you got to hear this one, and he would say, listen to the way he phrases this on the front, or listen to what the drummer does here. And I would sort of, I'd really listen. And so I heard Huey Smith records and Professor Longhair and Snooks Eaglin, and Clarence Henry and Fats Domino, as well as great Irish music. Clifton Chenier, he used to love. He was in New Orleans at a time when Fess used to alternate at Jed's with Clifton Chenier on Thursday nights.
Wow.
This is before Professor Longhair had made any LPs or had really kind of been... I guess it was really early days when Alison Minor had
started to work with him, right?
Starting to try and book him a few little gigs in town. So, yeah. So I grew up. That was my musical education as a sort of an 11-year-old.
And so, yeah, your uncle was a primary musical influence. I mean, he was your
He was a good
mentor.
musician too. Yeah. No, I played in his band. I played a gig with him in London about a couple of months ago, and we were just playing together at the family Christmas party last week. Yeah, he turned 80 last year.
He turned how old?
He turned 80.
80,
last
all
year,
right.
yeah.
And he's still playing.
Yeah.
Good for him. Good for him.
Yeah, he's a Johnny Snake Hips Johnson. That's his name.
Johnny Snake Hips Johnson? You're making that up. That's really what your uncle goes by?
Yeah.
That sounds like a guy that would live in a cave in Morocco. I mean, that sounds exactly what he would be doing.
Yeah.
All right, so fast forward a few years, you start playing in England. At some point, you decide to make your first pilgrimage to New Orleans. What precipitated that, and what were your initial impressions when you got to New Orleans initially?
Well, in England's a small country, so it's quite easy to go and have foreign experiences. You don't have to go very far, and so when you leave school, if you're going to, at the time when you leave school, and all of my friends were going to go to university, I didn't have any desire to go to university. I just wanted to go to New Orleans because I'd heard all these stories about New Orleans from my uncle, great sort of glamorous, exotic stories. And so I got a job on a construction site, carrying sheetrock up 10 flights of stairs every day, and then with a view to saving money to somehow get to New Orleans. I didn't really have a plan. But I spent most of the money, and by the time I did get to New Orleans, I only had $100. But I landed on my feet. It was a total leap into the darkness. I'd got on the plane to New Orleans, had a one-way ticket. And the week before I left, someone asked what I was going to do, and I said, I don't know. And they said, where are you going to stay? I said, I've got no idea. I can't believe my mum and dad let me go.
Because you were how old? You were how old at this
I was
point?
like 17 or 18. I was just out of school. But she gave me a a matchbox at the Maple Leaf Bar. There was her sister. This was my uncle's girlfriend at the time. Her sister was working behind the bar at the Maple Leaf. She was traveling through the States from California to Florida, just driving. And her and her boyfriend had got as far as New Orleans and stopped. And she had a job at the Maple Leaf Bar. And so I had a matchbox with the phone number. When I got to New Orleans Airport, I called the bar and asked to speak to Fiona, who happened to be working that night, thank God. Okay. And she said, just get in a taxi. And so I was able to sleep on her floor for the first few nights. And then I got it, and everything just fell into place. People were so kind. I was so lucky. In hindsight, it could have gone so horribly wrong, but everything just fell into place. And I got a job working at the bar. And the deal, this is so New Orleans, the owner of the bar, he was a guy, they called him the Fat Man.
Not to be confused with Fats Domino.
Not to do with food.
Right,
No.
right.
But he said, you need a job. I said, yeah, I really need a job. So, okay, I'll pay you. You can paint the bar. Or you can dig up the banana trees. That was the back was full of banana trees. And he said, I'll pay you. You get free drink. You get half price. You can come and see. You can get in and see all the bands free. I'll pay you by the hour, minimum wage, whatever it is, anything. I didn't care. And you can get half price drink when you come in at night. You get half price on all the drinks, and you get free drink while you work.
Free drinks while you work?
So the job.
It's very New Orleans.
Yeah, that turned into painting the bar. I went from digging up the banana trees. That went well over a few days. And then a buddy of mine showed up. So we're two teenagers. And he said, you want to paint the bar? Bar needs a paint job. Can you paint? I said, yeah, I never painted anything in my life. But I said, yeah. So we were employed. And it took us 6 months to paint the bar.
Perhaps your pay policy had something to do with that,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, the other thing, he said, you can work whatever hours you want. It doesn't matter. You can work 2 hours one day, 5 hours. So we'd roll in at sort of 2 o'clock. The bar, well, we'd roll into the bar. The bar opened at 3. We'd usually get there about 1 o'clock, very hungover. And we didn't have a key, but we could climb over the wall and get in and get the ladders and the paint and everything and start painting. But we'd start painting so late that in order to make up the money that we needed to go out later that night, we would still be up there painting in the dark. And we were terrible. And I would start off every day by sitting at the piano and playing for a couple of hours.
The piano in the Maple Leaf?
In the Maple Leaf, yeah. And the manager would sometimes come in and find me playing the piano when I was supposed to be painting, and he would get very angry with me. But one night when we'd been up painting very late, and people were already coming in to see James Booker. He used to play in there every Tuesday night. And he was just someone, he was in the bar all the time. His manager lived upstairs, and so he was just one of the characters in the bar all the time. So I saw Booker all the time. But one night he was supposed to play and got there late, or he didn't actually show up at all. And I was still covered in green paint, and the owner said, get that paint off you now, for God's sake, and get on that bloody piano and start playing, because all these people who bought their tickets, they're all going to start asking for their money back because he hasn't shown up. And so he said, make yourself useful for a change. And so I did. So that was my first piano gig.
That was your first New Orleans piano gig, taking off the painting clothes and filling in for James Booker, who was a no-show. Wow.
Yeah.
Again,
I was a guitar player. I wasn't a piano player. I was a guitar player. But I could play like 7 or 8 tunes on the piano. So I just kept playing them over and over again. No one seemed to mind.
Well, the later it got, the people probably noticed less and less that you were playing the same song. So it was fine. It was fine.
Yeah.
All right, so that was your foothold. But now you went back. That wasn't when you came to New Orleans to stay, though, right? Didn't you go back to England and came back later?
I stayed for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And then until the immigration department decided I'd been there
long enough
for a holiday. Yeah, it's a long vacation.
A 2-year holiday in New Orleans.
So I packed my bags and went to Jamaica, and then I went from Jamaica back to London. Well, back to London because I grew up in a village in the country, but I moved to London, and then started getting gigs on the pub circuit in London. There was a band called Diz and the Doormen that were playing New Orleans piano R&B. He was really good, Diz Watts.
Diz and the Doormen?
Diz and the Doormen, and they were playing the night after I got back. There's Nigel Hall walking in there.
The great Nigel Hall sneaking in, yes indeed.
I've just been bragging on you. Got it too late.
Yeah, you missed him. He was saying good things about you earlier, Nigel. We'll get him to repeat it later. Yeah.
I'll tell him all the bad stuff later on. I'll save that till the end. But we haven't got enough time to go into all that. It'll take too long. What was I saying? Yeah, so there's a band already doing that stuff, so I thought, I'm going to check them out. And so I got invited up to sit in, and at the end of the night, the guy that ran the joint said, you want to come back and do your own gig? And so I said, yeah, they needed someone the following week, so I just fell into that and used Dizzy's rhythm section, and that was the rhythm section I got hired to back Dr. Jon when he came to play in England in the mid-'80s. It was the first time he'd been, I think it was only the second time he'd ever been to England. He came over one time in a package with Alan and the Meters and Fess and did Montreux and shows in London.
So when he went over, he didn't bring his own band. He was picking up local musicians.
Yeah.
And so he was using some of the guys that you were playing with. And then you got an invitation.
But he needed a guitar player, so I got hired to play guitar.
For Dr. John, it was a little tour of England is what it was?
Yeah, it was just gigs around the London area. And then we had a BBC World Service radio session that we did. And then at the end of the session, everybody had split, and it was just me and Mac. I was in awe of Mac. I couldn't have, it was completely...
Mac Rebenak, a.k.a.
Dr.
John.
Yeah.
Right, Mac, yeah.
But he started playing. He was just on the piano, just fooling around, playing. There's a little Willie John tune called Fever. You gave me fever. And he was playing the piano. He goes, you gave me pneumonia. That was kind of funny. So I asked him if he liked Willie John, and he loved Willie John, and I loved Willie John. He's kind of an obscure singer. And so I said, he said, what do you know about little Willie John? I played him a tune. And he said, oh, man, you play piano. All right. He said, well, tonight on the gig, you play piano and I'll play guitar.
So Dr. John asked you to play piano on his gig, and he was going to switch to guitar, which he was a good guitar player too, though. I mean,
he was a good, great guitar player, yeah.
And wasn't the story? Yeah, I mean, if he hadn't gotten that gunshot wound on his hand, that's what turned him from guitar to piano, I think.
Well, when we did the rehearsal for the gig, I got the call to play with him, and the rehearsal was going to be at my bass player's house. And he moved in with my bass player because my bass player was a junkie, and he was a junkie. And so he could get his hookup.
Right.
But I went around to the house, and we were going to do a rehearsal, and there was no piano. The rehearsal was just me and him passing a guitar back and forth. And he would play me what he was going to play on the piano, and he played the most amazing, beautiful jazz voicings on the guitar. And I knew he had played guitar, and I've never heard him play guitar like that subsequently. I reminded him of it several times. He couldn't even remember. But he played some really great stuff. Yeah, he was amazing.
Well, and not to get out of the timeline here, but in later years, you ended up back in his band. Like in the latter part of his life, you were playing in his band again.
We had the same manager for a while, and he made a record, and I had a record out of Alan Toussaint tunes called A Cappella, and so I joined Mac's band to play guitar, second guitar, and some percussion and second keyboards as a kind of a utility musician, and then I would open up the shows doing my stuff. So yeah, we toured in all around the States and in Europe, and I can't remember if we went to Japan or not. Yeah. So I got to hang with him different times over the years. And he was, and he did every once in a while. There were a few occasions, like when I was living in New York, where I'd be kind of looking, the rent was due and things were kind of rough and the phone would ring, and it was like someone said, oh, Mac Rebenak can't do this gig, and he said, call you, can you come do it? So he would put work my way, which was nice, very helpful.
And you got to hear some great Mac stories, I guess, on the tour bus over the years.
His stories were great. I'm sure half of them weren't true. One time I asked on 3 separate occasions, because I love Johnny Guitar Watson, and I knew he'd crossed paths with Johnny Watson. So on 3 separate occasions, I asked him the first time he met Johnny Guitar Watson. I got 3 completely different stories, each of which were fantastic. Like, you couldn't even make this shit up, but somehow, I mean, they all had the ring of truth, but they couldn't all have been true. He's like, he said, I saved his life once. I said, what do you mean you saved? Johnny Guitar Watson's like, yeah. He said, Escarita was about to smash him in the head with a chair. I went, Johnny! And he jumped out of the way just in time. I'm sure it must have happened, but how would you know?
How would you come up with that?
But
right,
then the other stories were equally bizarre. But I don't think he let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Well, absolutely not. Absolutely not. That's not the New Orleans way.
One time he was around my house, and I asked him about, there used to be a cat in New Orleans who was a voodoo guy called the Chicken Man. And he was also known as Prince Kumali. But I said to him one time, "Hey, Mac," and this guy died or disappeared a long time ago. I said, "Hey, man, what was the? You'll probably know." He said, "What was the deal with the chicken man?" He said, "Which one?" So conversations with Mac were a bit like that. You know?
Because New Orleans being the sort of place
there were two chicken men.
could accommodate more than one chicken man, more than one voodoo chicken man.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. You know, you want to have a spare just in case.
Yeah, he said, you mean Prince Kamali or the other one? So I want to know about both of them. Yeah.
All right, so you're doing you're playing in England, you're working steady. So what prompted you then to come back and actually settle in New Orleans for good? I mean, what was the thing that made you pull the trigger on that?
I think I always knew I was going to come back. New Orleans was where it was at for me. I didn't like English music. And there's some great musicians there, but the musicians there, as you said earlier on, have this broad understanding and expert knowledge and an almost encyclopedic academic approach to learning about all this stuff, and they can tell you the difference between this style and this style and this stuff. But I found that when they played, quite often, the way they played was an amalgam of a little bit of Chicago blues, a little kind of few New Orleans chops, a few little jazz, and it was all kind of mixed up. But I wanted to play New Orleans. I really like New Orleans funk, which is not like other funk. It's not like Sly Stone or George Clinton understanding what funk means. New Orleans funk goes back to old music from 100 years ago, and I wanted to play it right. And I found it hard to find musicians in London that really had enough understanding of what made that style different. And I thought I could carry on doing it here, or I can go back to New Orleans and play with the cats that invented this shit. And that's kind of what I did.
And that's what you did. And then you, over the years, I mean, you've become one of the guys that people turn to as an example of a New Orleans piano player. At what point did you kind of have a sense like, okay, I'm legit. I can play in the style of New Orleans, and it sounds like New Orleans? Was there a certain point in your career where you're like, all right, this record, this is where I made the transition, this gig? Was there a point in time where you said, okay, I feel like I've got it now?
No, not really.
Still working on it?
I'm still working on it, yeah. I'm still trying to figure it out. But I mean, I started playing piano, trying to copy New Orleans R&B piano records. It's not like I had classical lessons at all. Played other stuff and then started to try and develop a New Orleans. So it's like I started speaking that language with that accent. So that's my default. Even though I speak English with an English accent, I play New Orleans piano. I play piano with a New Orleans accent. And if you're a session musician, you have to be able to shuffle that aside. If you get hired to play on something that doesn't need that, but that's sort of my natural default mode is what I play when I just sit down to play. It's a bit like if you're a character actor, you have whatever your natural speaking voice is, and you learn to use other accents if you want to get hired.
That's
to
right.
be able to play, be versatile and play other roles. So as a session musician, you have to be able to do that. But when I just sit down to play my natural voice on piano is New Orleans piano, because that's what I started playing.
Yeah, that was it was in your DNA from early on. Yeah, we Make It Funky that came out I think in 2005. It was a documentary of New Orleans funk, and you played I think Tipatina with Alan Toussaint in the film. Is that right?
Yeah, it was like a medley. I played a Cuban thing, which then morphed into Alan doing a take on Tipatina, but shift different modulation. He played it in D minor. He made it. You shift the root. And so that was a very clever thing he did. But I did a setup, which is from an old Cuban tune called La Baya Mesa by Cindo Garay, an old Cuban thing. So,
well, I mean, to do that with Alan and to play with Dr. John, I mean, to get the nod of approval from those sort of cats, that's a pretty...
they're my hero. Can you imagine them? Yeah, it's incredible. That was... When I was growing up, all these names were just names on the backs of records, the hard-to-find records in England, and... it was an incredible privilege to get a phone call from Earl King saying, "Hey, can you come make a gig or get hired to play behind Snooks or
Earl King, the great rhythm and blues songwriter, guitar player.
Yeah.
Snooks Eaglin, the great guitar player. Yeah. All these guys were New Orleans legends. Yeah.
Well, the things when I got to New Orleans, I had just assumed that there'd be hundreds of really great piano players that I hadn't heard of, and I realized fairly quickly that it was almost a lost art. The old guys were playing it, but the 70s generation of keyboard players had gravitated towards the Fender Rhodes and the Hammond B3 organ because you could move them and you could play them loud and plug them into amps. And the piano was a little bit of an archaic kind of sound that was considered old-timey. And so it wasn't of much interest to kids that were my age, particularly. So as a consequence, it meant there weren't many people who had that skill set. And the old guys were delighted to find someone young that was very cheap that actually knew their material. And I knew the piano solos from the original records, and so they always asked me back. So it was great. So I got to play with all my idols.
Well, you got to know Fats Domino at some point too, didn't you?
Towards the end of his life, I got to meet Fats, and I'd go over to his house and play piano. He was starting to suffer from dementia, but that part of your brain that deals with music, that part of his brain was still completely functioning like a well-honed motor, So I would go over. His daughter liked it when I went over because I would sit and play the piano, and then gradually he'd sort of gravitate, and then he'd come and lean on the piano, then I'd shuffle over and he'd sit down, and then he'd start playing. The next minute we're playing some old Albert Hammond's boogie-woogie stuff. And he was amazing. He was amazing. It was absolutely no loss of dexterity, and it was great. So.
And didn't you get to introduce your parents to Fats?
Yeah, they came over one year and I took them around Fats' house. I don't think they could believe it because they had Fats Domino records when they were teenagers, so come over to his house and hang out. That was pretty cool for them. Yeah.
Their son introduces them to Fats Domino. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. I had a similar experience. I introduced my dad to Fats, and my dad.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. So apparently that's a badge of honor in New Orleans if you can introduce your parents to Fats Domino at some point.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
He was great. Great. I love Fats Domino.
Yeah, one of a kind.
Everybody in New Orleans loved Fats Domino.
Yeah, and Fats would be like, he's such a regular guy. You'd see him at like the Home Depot, like buying a toilet seat or whatever. He's just like, but it goes back to your point earlier when you were talking about the grass always being greener and people in England appreciating the music more. In New Orleans, Fats is just the guy you see at the Home Depot, it's hard, or Alan Toussaint's the guy you see driving around in a fancy Rolls Royce.
It's a small town, New Orleans, that's why one of the things I love about New Orleans is big enough for you to be able to get a little bit lost. But there's like 1 or 2 degrees of separation in New Orleans, where perhaps there are 3 or 4 in other big cities.
Right. And
I've lived in London, I've lived in New York. But in New Orleans, all those big stars in New Orleans, they could never get big-headed, because you're living around, you're right there. You're not on a pedestal somewhere. You're doing your shopping in Schwegmann's. Or
exactly. You're going to run into him somewhere. You're
get your driver's license. You might be sitting next to, Irving Charles or Bunchy John, or any of these great, sort of fantastic musicians.
Well, and that's a rule I've had to remind myself as a critic. When I write something about someone, I have to realize I may run into them and I have to back it up face to face,
Yeah,
so,
for real.
I got a call from Dr. John one time. I'd written something about the latter period of his career. He had some people in the band that it didn't really work out so well, and I'd written something about that, and he called me and he's like, what's all this you been writing about, Yoko Ono in my band, and I'm like, Mac, I said, I didn't write that. I said, you can look up what I wrote and see it, online. And he's like, all right, I'll get my partner to look it up on the computer machine. I'm like, check it on the computer machine and you will see that I did not write that. So that was my poor Dr. John impersonation, yes. Yeah. You talked earlier about how you have to sort of adjust the accent of your playing depending on the gig. You spent a bunch of years...
depending on if you're hired to play somebody else's music.
Exactly. I.e., you spent a bunch of years in Bonnie Raitt's band. But she kind of wanted you to bring a little bit of the New Orleans flavor in there, right?
I didn't have to change anything. Well, that's not true, because she's got a varied selection of musical styles, so the New Orleans thing wasn't appropriate on some things, so if you're playing I Can't Make You Love Me, you don't want to play any Professor Longhair chops in the middle of it.
So, I can't even imagine that.
Yeah. But with Taj, when I was in Taj's band, they got hired to play the New Orleans, basically to play the New Orleans thing, but I had to be able to step away from that if that's what the song required. So if you're playing like a Chicago blues, then you have to know what Otis Spann sounded like.
Well, and Bonnie recorded a couple of your songs, right? One or two?
She did four songs of mine over a couple of records.
So that, which is, I mean, as a songwriter, that's a heck of a feather in your cap right there. I mean, that's a good thing to have.
Yeah. And we co-wrote a song on her last record. It's very flattering. It's lovely when somebody does a song of yours.
And it's nice.
Very rarely that it ever sounds the way you expected it to sound. Through somebody else's unique set of filters, it changes into something else, which is interesting. Interestingly, Taj has just recorded 4 of Johnny Snakehip Johnson's tunes on his next record.
Wait, he did some of your uncle's songs?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, he's cut 4 of my uncle's songs on his next record. So that'll be interesting to hear what John says when he hears them on the actual thing.
Wow, Snakehip's getting his time in the sun. He's getting his star turn. That's awesome.
Yeah, he's a good songwriter. Yeah, great.
Let's talk about a couple of songs you've done. You played a couple last night, a couple of new tunes that are going to be on your forthcoming rerecord, I think, right?
Yeah.
There was one about a pickle and a tickle.
In a pickle for a tickle.
In a pickle for a tickle.
Yes.
Where did that phrase come from?
I don't know where any of these phrases come from. Really, it must come from. I must have heard it somewhere, or it just kind of fit. The idea for the song was loosely based on an old Pres Prado tune that I used to love years and years ago, which has it's kind of like a habanera that breaks down into a sort of almost like a merengue thing. So that's what that song does. It breaks down into a 2/4 merengue kind of feel, which is a lot of fun to play. Then the pickle for a tickle. No idea where that came from. Absolutely no idea. Well, I think I'd actually I did a recording session with James Singleton, Doug Belote several years previously, which was a cover of a song it was a song that we were doing on a gig, and we had a bunch of songs recorded in a little studio session that we did, and I decided it was different enough that I wanted to put some different words to it, and so a lot of these songs kind of evolve,
Yeah.
So it's got a long history. But the pickle and the tickle and the slap and tickle, I've got no idea. I can't remember.
All right, well, I want to quote the lyric from another song that you did last night, just to make sure I get it right. I don't want no ifs, ands, or buts. Take your hands off my nuts. So...
Yes.
So let's
for the folks that may not know, taking this seriously enough.
For the folks who may not know that reference, why don't you explain what that one is about?
Well, I have to explain this when we're on tour, because you have to assume that most people in the audience are not particularly au fait with New Orleans culture. So I wrote the song on an aeroplane. It just came to me as a kind of a funny little ditty. But it's about Zulu coconuts, and really the inspiration is, and everyone here I'm sure knows what Zulu coconuts are in the Zulu parade.
The Zulu parade, right, and the coconut's the treasured
My
catch
cousin came over one time, she was delighted to catch a Zulu coconut, and she carried this thing all day long through Mardi Gras. We were out all day partying in the Quarter, and then in the Treme, the Indians, and then out at night, and finally about 4 o'clock in the morning, we finally got home. And she reached for the key and dropped it, and it shattered on the floor, and she was heartbroken. Anyway, so they will break if you drop them, and so that was the idea. It's like, if you come round to anybody's house in New Orleans, you'll see Zulu coconuts, and they're cherished and they're placed up on the mantelpiece and whatever. And the whole song basically is admire them, leave them alone, view them from a distance. Don't pick them up. If you drop them and break them, you're in trouble. Keep your hands off my nuts.
Words to live by. That's indeed words to live by. The you won your Go-Go Juice record, great record. That was one that won the Grammy, right?
Yes.
Won a Grammy for the Go-Go Juice. Yes, yeah. Good record. Congratulations on the Grammy.
Thank you.
Where do you have your Grammy? Where do you keep it?
It's kind of sort of tucked away somewhere. But I'm really hoping this next, I've got a bit of a plan. I'm really hoping this next record wins a Grammy, because I want 2, because then I can put a piece of dowel between them, between the two horns, and then it'd be a great toilet roll dispenser. I'll have the only, I can put it in the bathroom, and I'll have the only Grammy toilet roll dispenser in New Orleans. Nothing. I'm very proud of it. Nothing disrespectful, but it'll have extra utility. Being practical.
Just being practical. Well, that's the post-war attitude, in England.
Exactly,
You've got to use everything.
What you got.
Use what you got. So the record, it's the forthcoming record called the Bywater Sessions, named for the neighborhood in New Orleans where you live.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about what we can expect from that record and the origins.
Okay, well, it's quite simple, really. It's just I have this amazing band. I can't believe how lucky I am to share the stage with cats like Nigel Hall and Pedro Segundo, world-class percussionist. Oh, thank you. I mean, they're just great musicians. And, top musicians are in very high demand. So it's not every... I mean, they're all here from the boat this time. It's amazing. But quite often, Nigel tours with Lettuce. He does gigs under his own name. Xavier Lin is often out with Mono Neon or Lettucey. And Pedro plays with Philharmonic and symphonic orchestras. And he's classically trained at the Guildhall School of Music, so he's doing a lot of symphonic gigs. So they're all busy cats, but when we do get together, it's just magic. And I really wanted the band was sounding so good that I really wanted to just get a record of what it sounds like right now. And so we had a chance after I finally got my studio rebuilt. We got a lot of damage in Hurricane Ida. And we had to rebuild the whole studio, basically take it down to the studs and rebuild it all because we had a lot of water. So once it was done, we were able to move the gear back in, and everybody was available for 2 days. And so we got everybody in the room, and we just pressed record, and we basically played what we do on the gig. Because, as I say, they're all top session musicians. A lot of the songs we didn't need to do second takes. They were just... It sounded great, and I brought John Porter, who's produced all my records. He flew in from England. He's produced hundreds of records, everyone from the Rolling Stones to whoever. Anyway, he was there just to cast his expert eye and just say, just do that again, or he would spot a microphone that had got moved a little bit, and he would move that. We had a great engineer. So we spent 2 days, and we recorded about 20 tunes. The gig, basically what we do live. And then I selected 10. You can get 5 on each side of a vinyl record. You only get like 22 minutes of music. So I selected the 10 that I thought represented as well. And so some of them are brand new tunes, and some are tunes which we've actually recorded before, but they've changed over the years. The way New Orleans music is performed is that you have a framework and you improvise within that framework, and you get great players who will perform the song differently every time. And you play off of everybody else, and no two performances are the same. And as you perform these songs night after night on tours and gigs over the years, they morph and evolve in a sort of Darwinian fashion. Somebody will try something out, and all the guys in the band will look around and go, wow, that was cool. And then so the next gig it happens again and becomes part of the arrangement. Or someone will try something out and the guys will look around and go, no, that's not cool at all. So, I might suggest an idea and we try it and he's like, no, that's no good. So that doesn't happen. So they get better and they evolve. So we start, all these years I've been playing Tipatina, but it's sort of evolved into a 4-part it's nothing like Tipatina by the time we're sort of 16 bars into it. So we cut that, and I didn't want to sing Tipatina, so I wrote some new lyrics as a sort of a tribute to Fess. We called it Fess a Long Hair Boogaloo, because we actually do a kind of a... Boogaloo was a style that emerged in the 60s in New York, in Harlem, when soul music and the Puerto Rican musicians were starting to blend into this new thing. They were playing with congas and all the grooves and singing in English. And the lions of that Puerto Rican world frowned on it and stopped it. Tito Puente and Tito Rodriguez, they said no. And that died. But it was called, for a short window, it was called Boogaloo. And so that's kind of what our version of Tipitino is like. It's like a boogaloo take on the Junkers blues. So I call it Fessa Longhair's Boogaloo.
And that came out of a 2-day session that y'all did with all those musicians.
Well, it's because the involvement the arrangement has evolved over the last 15 years of us playing it. But this is just like a snapshot of what we do now. Come see us in a year's time, it'll be different.
Totally different. That's right. That's right. And you're going to put it out on vinyl, the new record?
Yeah, we're going to put it out on vinyl and CD. Don't ask me why, because no one's got record players, no one's got CD players.
Oh, I don't know. Is that true? No.
Present company
no.
accepted. Well, because
Yeah.
you all are music lovers and you all love New Orleans. So, but in the big wide world, we're in a strange time, really, because my way of thinking is, look. See.
Oh, look at that. You got a Jon Cleary vinyl right there, purchased at the, yes.
Well, we're in a room surrounded by music lovers, so of course.
Exactly. This is not a representative sampling.
A representative sample. But out in the big wide world, you can't even buy a CD player at a lot of the big stores anymore, and you don't have them in laptops or buy a new car. It doesn't have a CD player. And a lot of people got rid of their record players when CDs came out. So anyway, we still make them, and we sell them on gigs.
Well,
but it's very hard, really, because you can spend a lot of time making a record, and I take pride in the artwork and the details. I remember when I was there, and everybody in here will know the delight as a youngster going out and spending your hard-earned cash on a record that you really wanted and bringing it home, taking out that little crackle of the static electricity as you took it out of the sleeve, and then you put it on, you put the needle down, and then you start reading the liner notes, and you listen to a brand new record, and you're holding this thing in your hand, and the music is encapsulated and embodied in a piece of plastic, something tactile and tangible that you can hold. And I think that goes back to our sort of caveman instincts of actually of owning something and being able to pick it up and put it down and touch it and roll a joint on it. And, and so the idea now that you make a record and then it goes straight to Spotify and where is it? Where does it exist? Yeah. And it gets put in a playlist and it gets shuffled and it's distributed. Part of the experience of buying a record has been lost, I think, and I don't suppose young kids who never knew that will ever miss it. I certainly miss it. So yeah, I insisted that I wanted to make it available as a record, but it's just a romantic gesture, really. It's not very practical in this day and age. But I'm going to do it anyway and hope people buy the records.
Oh, good. Good. I mean, look, you can't roll a joint on an MP3, on a digital file. I mean, you just can't.
No, it's quite hard to roll one on a CD. The LPs are much, much better. But, so I'm told.
So you're told, exactly. So you hear. We should mention that you are going to be, speaking of vinyl, you're going to be signing merch that will be available for purchase right after this session.
Yeah, we got
right down that hallway.
LPs and T-shirts and some. And in lockdown, because I couldn't do any gigs, I started painting. And so I started you have to do something, right?
Absolutely.
So I started doing some polo. You got one right there.
Ah, there's one of his prints. So we're also selling your prints here on the.
So we got the prints for sale. Yeah, they're basically just funky New Orleans music joints. So a lot of I started doing them to accompany silly Facebook posts, and then people started asking if they were available, and so we decided we'd make some available one last year at Christmas, and a lot of people bought them. Cool. So I thought, okay, well, if people would like them, then fair enough.
Well, absolutely. No, I mean, your creative output, your Facebook posts, you call them silly little Facebook posts, but I mean, some of them I think qualify as literature. They're very funny and very, the way that you weave in and out.
That's a searing indictment of the state of contemporary literature. if that's true. No, basically it's just a sign of someone with too much time on his hands. Touring musicians spend most of their time waiting around in dressing rooms, in airports, waiting lounges, in cars, in taxis.
And boats.
And boats.
Yeah.
Although this is a nice place to be hanging out in, but you have a lot of time on your hands. So I started doing it was sort of dispatch from the front lines, really. It started off someone, I don't really like social media, but someone had set me up with a Facebook page, and I happened to be in New Orleans airport waiting for a flight, and they were playing an Ernie Cado song. So I just Thought, well, I'll try this out, and just posted. I'm sitting in New Orleans airport listening to Ernie Cato. And then about 10 minutes later, all these responses, and people were interested. And so, so I write these things, and it's like a bit like playing music, and it's a chance to get the grey matter turning a little bit, and more of a productive way of spending the time than reading Facebook.
That's right. Exactly.
Writing on Facebook.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're about out of time. I wanted to see if we have any questions, but one last question for you. Did you record any of your uncle's songs on the forthcoming album?
No, but there was a song on the last record, on the Boneyard, a song called Boneyard that we played last night, that's based around a really funky riff. When I was a little kid, and he'd come back. When he was in New Orleans for a few years, and when he left, he couldn't bear the thought of coming straight back to England. That would be too much of a culture shock. So he left New Orleans and went straight to Ireland, and then travelled south in Ireland and got on a ferry to a little island called Shirkin, and he lived there for 6 months. This is like 1975, at a time when the Irish hippie generation were rediscovering the Gaelic traditions of their grandparents. Mm-hmm. And so he became part of a small world of these guys who went on to become quite famous traditional Irish musicians. They were excellent musicians. And when he came back then eventually to London, I can remember being up at my grandmother's house, and he was playing this guitar riff. I was about 11 years old. So his hands looked really big. And he was playing this great riff, and really unusual. And to me, it sounded, in later years, it sounded like a cross between a sort of a Gaelic Irish reel and a Professor Longhair riff. Like if Fess had grown up in Dublin, that's what it sounded like. And so when I wrote Boneyard, it was supposed to be, I was going to collaborate with Dr. John on some music for a children's television show, which never happened, about a character who was a skeleton cartoon. And so I wrote this song, this idea called Boneyard, and I asked John if I could use his riff, so he actually played the guitar riff on that tune. Well, it's me and him playing it together.
That's awesome. Bringing it full circle. Very cool.
Yeah, so he's a co-writer on that tune.
Very cool. Yeah. All right. Well, the last couple minutes, do we have any questions? Anybody? Yep. Yes, ma'am.
John, every chance we get, we see you at Titina's. That's my favorite thing.
Thank you.
We just saw you a week or so ago.
Oh, right.
Earlier last year, you had a young man playing with you. He opened for you. I forget his name.
River Eckert. Yeah. He's the son of Jake Eckert, who was a guitar player in the Dirty Dozen. And he's really good. He's good. He's very...
New Orleans Suspects as well, right?
Yeah, that's right, yes.
Amazing. So my question is it getting harder to find these young people to continue this music?
Well, I think what you might find is that there are young people coming up, but they might be coming up in Poland or England or Spain or, because now with YouTube, of course, all this information is right there. When I was a young kid, those records didn't exist in England. They didn't exist in most parts of the States. You had to go to Jim Russell's on Magazine Street if you wanted to find some of these obscure records. And now you just go and you pull your phone out and type it in, and it comes up. Everything's there. So anyone around the world who just has a feel for that stuff now has access to the information. They don't have to go to New Orleans. I mean, I still think it's important to actually live in the city of New Orleans if you're going to play that music right. You have to drink the water and stumble around in second lines.
Trip in a pothole, fall in a pothole, et cetera, et cetera. Yes,
been there, done that. Jake's son is from New Orleans. He's really good. I hope he keeps it up.
Yeah, definitely a name to watch down the road. River Eckert, for sure.
Yeah.
River is
his great.
Name. Yeah, he's very young.
Yeah.
Yes.
John, I don't know what I'd do with it, but could you put out a double album?
He's doubling down. A double album.
The last album, Dynamite, ended up being a double album because I didn't think of the limitations of how many minutes you could get, and we made the CD, and then we made the record, and we couldn't fit all the tunes on the record. So we ended up pressing it as a double. I had to go on to two LPs, so it's actually... But it's a great sounding record because all the grooves are really big because we got three tunes to a side.
Right. Yeah, usually a lot of... It really lets them breathe, though. I mean, it lets them breathe. Yeah. Yep.
Where in England did you grow up?
I grew up in a little village called Cranbrook in Kent, in the southeast. My family were all Londoners, And my mum and dad grew up in the war years and were evacuated when the bombs were dropping. And my dad saw a cow for the first time. He'd seen pictures of cows, but he'd never seen an actual cow. And he said he made a promise to himself that if he grew up and had kids, they would grow up in the countryside. So I was born in London, but they moved down to the country when I was very little. So I grew up in a small country town.
You were there for a while. You didn't move around the country.
No, I grew up in Cranbrook and then left and went to New Orleans.
Siblings?
Yeah. No, I've got 2 brothers and a sister. Big extended London Irish family. And a lot of musicians in the family. I had 3 uncles. I had 3 band leaders in the family at one point. And my grandmother was a singer in the 40s. Her stage name was Sweet Dolly Daydream. And I grew up playing her piano. And her husband, my granddad, was a tap dancer and a singer who was billed as Frank Neville, the little fellow with the educated feet.
Your family has some awesome nicknames. My gosh, yeah. That's incredible.
Yeah, my dad's dad played piano and drums. It was an interesting character.
It was in the blood. The music was in the blood.
Yeah, music's in the blood, definitely. So we've got a couple of my young nephews are getting interested in playing now. So I've got them guitars and pianos. And at the family party, they were up
Doing
got
their
my
thing.
nephew Johnny playing a Huey Piano Smith piano solo. It's pretty killer. Yeah,
That's awesome. You're that uncle now. You're
I'm the
that uncle.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm the old uncle now.
Yeah.
But my sister sings, and my wife played some guitar and sang, and it was a big family affair. Everybody. It's like the old way they used to have London parties in the old days, where everyone entertained themselves before record players and radios and whatever.
Right.
So that's long tradition as far as we can remember. And the piano in the living room, my mum and dad's, was my grandmother's piano. So that's been at the centre of all our family parties for 100 years.
Wow.
And they're still there and still gets played, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Last one.
Yeah, John, could you talk a little bit about Patreon as a way of getting...
Although I think I'm going to start a Substack site fairly soon. I think that's actually more, Substack is a site that you can subscribe to. You can provide free content, but people can subscribe. And it's not really used by writers primarily, but you can post all sorts of content, music and videos and other sorts of stuff. So it's a nice way of interacting directly with your fans. You know, in the past, there was always a lot of people in between in the various stages, but it's very nice with the internet now that you can actually communicate directly with your fans, and you can provide content that wouldn't otherwise become available. Make the old accepted cycle of making one record every 2 or 3 years and then touring behind it is still kind of cool. But the idea that you can play a tune and put it up and people and fans of yours can get more of an intimate sort of relationship with you through personal music stuff. So you wouldn't necessarily put out on a record. It might just be me sitting down after I've had dinner and just bashing out a couple of boogie woogies or just making some stuff up. Same with the paintings and writing or whatever. So it's a nice way to be able to make your artistic expressions in whatever particular form available to people who are interested, if they are interested. You know, you don't like it, you don't have to sign up for it. You know, it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of cool, yeah. Okay. And it's a different, it's an alternative to the more conventional methods of disseminating and distributing the work that you do.
Well, that is the new way to do it, but you're going to do it the old-fashioned way right after the session. You're going to sign some records and stuff right back over there.
For all the music lovers, if anybody wants to get a signed thing, I'd be very happy to do it. And it's a nice way to get to meet people too after the end of a show. When I always sign stuff after a show, and it's nice to get to chat to the people who've, because people come up to your gigs, man, they're spending money that they've worked hard for.
That's right.
And it's a real, it's very flattering that of all the things they could spend it on, they choose to come to see us do what we do. And that's why we take great pride in what we do and work really hard. There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes that the punters don't ever see, the rehearsals and the work. And when we walk on the stage and it all looks really polished, and that's because you're seeing the tip of the iceberg.
You've done the work.
So the fact that you all appreciate it is wonderful, because without you guys, we wouldn't be able to to do it for a living. You know, it would just be a hobby. I mean, it's a hobby. You can't dedicate all your time to do it, to doing it really well. So when the chance to meet people as you sign, or just meet people when you're here on the boat, you know, it's different from a one-off gig in a room, in a club, in a bar, or whatever. It's an entirely different experience. That's what makes these cruises so special, really.
Absolutely. Well, yes, you've obviously done the work. You guys sounded great yesterday. I'm sure you're going to have some
Thank
other
you.
great shows throughout the course of this
We're going to have
cruise.
some great shows. We're going to have a horn section, too, on the next couple of gigs.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Jon Cleary.